Cleveland in the 1930s, a city at the crossroads. The 1930s were hard years for Cleveland. Once a booming industrial powerhouse, the city had been hammered by the Great Depression. By 1933, unemployment had skyrocketed to nearly 40%, leaving entire families without income. Shantytowns sprouted along the Cuyahoga River and across Kingsbury Run, a neglected ravine cutting through Cleveland's east side. These makeshift camps of cardboard, tin, and scavenged wood were dubbed Hoovervilles, a bitter jab at President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the economic collapse. Cleveland was, at the same time, a city of progress and decay. Skyscrapers rose downtown while thousands starved in the shadow of steel mills. The flats reeked of smoke and sewage, and crime festered in the alleys. Prohibition had ended, but bootlegging had left behind a thriving underworld of gambling, prostitution, and organized crime. Kingsbury Run itself was both a physical and symbolic scar. The ravine slopes were crowded with rail yards, factories, and the hovels of the poor. Police officers disliked venturing into it, too dangerous, too unpredictable. For the transient men and women who made it home, it was a place of last resort, away from society's gaze. And for a killer who wanted to hunt the forgotten, Kingsbury Run was perfect. The first victim, a prelude in 1934. Though the torso murders are often dated from 1935, some historians argue the killer's work began earlier. In September 1934, a beachcomber walking along Lake Erie discovered the remains of a young man. The corpse had been decapitated, the head missing, and the skin had been treated with a strange chemical preservative that turned it reddish and leathery. At the time, police cataloged it as a bizarre but isolated crime. They didn't yet see the pattern. It was only with hindsight that investigators connected this mutilated corpse to the murders that would soon terrorize the city. September 1935, Jackass Hill. The torso killer announced himself to Cleveland in September 1935 with a double horror. Two young boys exploring Jackass Hill, an area overlooking Kingsbury Run, stumbled upon a gruesome sight. There, in a weed-filled gully, lay the body of a man. He had been decapitated, castrated, and his skin bore the same odd reddish tint as the Lake Erie victim. His head was never recovered. The man was later identified as Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old petty criminal and heavy drinker who frequented the city's bars and flophouses. Andrassy was known to police. He had arrests for disorderly conduct and had ties to the seedy underbelly of Cleveland nightlife. Not far from Andrassy's remains, police found another body. This one belonged to an unidentified man, killed and mutilated in the same fashion. Two victims, discovered within yards of each other, shocked Cleveland. The newspapers seized on the story. Headlines screamed of a headhunting fiend and the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run. Sketches of the decapitated torsos, sensational descriptions of mutilation, and speculation about a maniac surgeon filled the pages. The public imagination ignited. Who could do this? Why were heads missing? Was there a ritualistic element? Cleveland, already uneasy from economic despair, found itself gripped by fear. The perfect hunting ground. Kingsbury Run was the ideal landscape for a killer who wanted to prey on the vulnerable. Its shantytowns housed the homeless, drifters, and alcoholics, people who often had no families to report them missing. Many lived hand-to-mouth, scavenging for food or working day labor. Some were sex workers, some were addicts. When one of these people vanished, it rarely made the news. When their dismembered body appeared weeks later, it was nearly impossible to identify. For the torso killer, this invisibility was his shield. The geography also helped. The run's overgrown gullies and abandoned sheds provided cover for both murder and disposal. Trains thundered overhead, drowning out cries for help. The flats, with their rail yards and factories, created endless hiding places for body parts. The killer seemed to understand this environment intimately, choosing places where the bodies would be discovered, but not immediately linked to him. It was as if he wanted to strike fear as much as he wanted to kill. January 1936, the case of Florence Polillo. The new year brought a new victim. On January 26, 1936, a man walking in the flats discovered 2 bushel baskets stuffed with human remains. Inside were parts of a woman, later identified as Florence Genevieve Polillo, a 41-year-old barmaid and sex worker who lived a precarious life on the city's margins. Florence's murder fit the pattern: decapitation, dismemberment, and a scattering of body parts. Some were found wrapped in newspaper, left in plain sight as though placed deliberately. Florence had lived in a boarding house and was known for her colorful personality, but she also struggled with alcohol and money troubles. Her disappearance had gone largely unnoticed until the discovery of her remains. The police now faced a grim realization: Cleveland had a serial killer. June 1936, the Newburgh Road Bridge. On June 5, 1936, teenagers playing near the Newburgh Road Bridge stumbled upon yet another atrocity. The bodies of 2 headless men had been dumped there, partially decomposed. One was tentatively identified as Charles Smiley Carroll, a homeless man. The other was never identified. The coroner's report added a horrifying detail. At least one of the victims had been dismembered while still alive. The level of cruelty stunned even seasoned investigators. The public's fear escalated. These were not crimes of passion. These were not robberies gone wrong. These were deliberate, sadistic mutilations by someone who killed for reasons no one could understand. Patterns of a killer. By mid-1936, detectives pieced together a profile of the murderer. Method of death. Nearly every victim was decapitated, some dismembered while alive. Disposal. Bodies were often placed where they would be discovered, suggesting the killer wanted attention. Anatomical skill. Cuts were clean, sometimes surgical. Investigators theorized the killer could be a doctor, butcher, or someone with medical training. Victim choice. The murdered were often from society's fringes: sex workers, homeless men, petty criminals, alcoholics. This pattern painted the portrait of a calculating predator, yet the police had no leads. Cleveland police under pressure. By now, 6 known victims had been discovered. The police department, already strained by Depression-era budget cuts, struggled to keep up. Forensic science in the 1930s was rudimentary. Without fingerprints or dental records, identifying the dead was often impossible. Detectives interviewed scores of witnesses, combed the shantytowns, and questioned butchers, doctors, and vagrants. But the killer left no fingerprints, no weapons, no witnesses. The press roasted the police. Editorials mocked their incompetence. Cartoons depicted bumbling officers outsmarted by a phantom butcher. Public confidence in law enforcement plummeted. City officials knew they needed help, and Cleveland had one name that inspired confidence: Eliot Ness. Enter Eliot Ness. In December 1935, Cleveland's new mayor, Harold Burton, had recruited Eliot Ness as the city's safety director. Ness was already a national hero, famous for leading the Untouchables in Chicago and helping bring down Al Capone. In Cleveland, his job was to reform the police, root out corruption, and modernize the fire department. By mid-1936, Ness could no longer ignore the torso killer. Though homicide detectives officially handled the investigation, the public wanted Ness to take charge. His reputation for incorruptible toughness made him the city's last hope. Ness agreed to become more involved, but the Butcher of Kingsbury Run would prove to be a far more elusive foe than Al Capone. Summer of Fear. The summer of 1936 was one of terror. As more bodies appeared, rumors spread like wildfire. Parents forbade children from going near the rail yards. Bartenders whispered about a mad doctor on the loose. Some speculated the killer was targeting the poor to cleanse the city of undesirables. The media only fueled the hysteria. Newspapers printed gory sketches of the decapitated bodies. Journalists coined chilling nicknames: the Mad Butcher, the Head Hunter, the Ghoul of Kingsbury Run. Each discovery became a public spectacle. Crowds gathered near crime scenes, craning for a look at the latest victim. Reporters scribbled notes, photographers snapped pictures, and detectives scowled at the circus. It seemed as though the killer fed on the attention. The more the city panicked, the more he killed. By the close of 1936, at least 6 confirmed victims of the Cleveland torso killer had been discovered. Each one had been mutilated in ways that suggested both skill and sadism. Each one deepened the city's fear. Cleveland, already battered by poverty, crime, and corruption, now faced an invisible predator who mocked the police at every turn. Eliot Ness, the city's famed crime fighter, was about to enter the fray. But as the investigation expanded, so too would the body count. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run was far from finished. The string of murders that had begun with the shocking discoveries in Kingsbury Run was no longer an isolated mystery. By 1936, Cleveland had become a city under siege from a killer who seemed to emerge from the shadows with surgical precision. Each new discovery added not only another victim to the growing list, but another layer of fear to a city already struggling under the weight of the Great Depression. People spoke in hushed tones about the torso killer, and the once bustling neighborhoods near the Cuyahoga River began to thin out at night. What terrified people most wasn't just the brutality of the crimes, but the randomness. Victims were poor, transient, often nameless. They could be anyone, and that made everyone uneasy. The newspapers thrived on the horror. Banner headlines screamed of dismembered victims and headless horrors, splashing gruesome details across the front page. The lurid descriptions both captivated and terrified readers. It was as if the killer himself was reading the papers, taking pride in his notoriety. In homes across Cleveland, families locked doors earlier, curfews tightened, and even hardened factory workers cast wary glances down dark alleys. Police scrambled to maintain order. The city's homicide detectives, already overworked with gang-related killings, robberies, and domestic crimes, now faced a predator who left virtually no useful evidence behind. Corpses were often stripped of identifying features, decapitated, and dismembered with such skill that coroners suggested the killer might have surgical training. Others argued he could simply be a butcher, familiar with how to separate flesh from bone. Whoever he was, his meticulous methods mocked the police's limited forensic tools. Fingerprinting was unreliable, dental records often missing, and blood typing could only narrow possibilities slightly. This was an age before DNA, before modern criminal profiling. The murderer knew it, and he exploited every gap. By mid-1936, at least 6 bodies had been found, and the city was clamoring for leadership. Enter Eliot Ness, the man who had helped bring down Al Capone during Prohibition. Appointed Cleveland's safety director, Ness was already a celebrity figure. His reputation as a fearless crime buster made him a natural candidate to oversee the investigation. To the public, his arrival meant hope. If anyone could stop the torso killer, it had to be the man who had broken the Chicago mob. But Ness quickly realized this was not a battle fought with machine guns and raids on breweries. The torso killer wasn't leaving paper trails or bribes. He was leaving bodies, mangled beyond recognition. Ness threw himself into the work, building a task force that coordinated police, coroners, and detectives across precincts. He ordered more patrols around Kingsbury Run and tried to impose some measure of order on the chaos. Despite his efforts, the killer remained ahead. In July 1936, 2 boys stumbled upon a pair of decapitated corpses wrapped in burlap. The victims had been meticulously drained of blood, the heads never found. Panic rose to a fever pitch. Rumors spread that the killer lived among them, that he lurked in the very shanty towns where the homeless sought shelter. Cleveland's poorest residents, already despised by many for being jobless or transient, now carried an additional stigma: suspicion. Ness faced a difficult decision. The shantytowns of Kingsbury Run had become both a refuge for the desperate and, in his eyes, a hunting ground for the killer. Convinced that the murderer hid there, he launched one of the most controversial actions of his career. In a sweeping nighttime raid, police rounded up hundreds of men, interrogating them under harsh conditions. Then, under Ness's orders, the shantytown shacks were burned to the ground. Flames lit up the night sky as men, women, and children watched their makeshift homes turn to ash. Ness justified the raid as a way to flush out the killer and cut off his access to vulnerable victims. But critics saw it differently. Newspapers and community leaders accused him of cruelty, punishing the innocent poor for the crimes of one man. In hindsight, the raid accomplished little. The killings continued, and Ness's once spotless reputation began to tarnish. For all his fame, he couldn't deliver what the city demanded most: an arrest. Meanwhile, the coroner, Dr. Samuel Gerber, began to develop a rough profile of the killer based on the patterns. The victims were often decapitated, sometimes while still alive, suggesting a sadistic streak. Many showed evidence of chemical burns or preservation, indicating the killer experimented with ways to slow decomposition. This chilling detail suggested not only brutality, but also patience. Whoever the murderer was, he wasn't killing in a frenzy. He was calm, calculating, taking his time with each victim. Victim identification proved maddeningly difficult. Many were transients, drifters who came to Cleveland looking for work during the Depression. Some had no family to claim them, no records to confirm their names. One victim was identified only by the distinctive tattoos on his arms, leading the press to dub him the Tattooed Man. Another was identified as Florence Polillo, a waitress and barmaid whose body was discovered in baskets and tubs scattered around the city. Her gruesome fate only fueled the public's terror. If the killer could strike a familiar face in the neighborhood, no one was truly safe. The press fed on this uncertainty. Reporters crafted narratives around each victim, speculating about the killer's motives. Was he targeting the poor because they were vulnerable? Was he a doctor experimenting on human bodies? Was he driven by hatred of women or men or society itself? The speculation turned the case into a citywide obsession. Bars buzzed with theories, families whispered them over dinner tables, and amateur sleuths flooded police with tips, most of them useless. As 1937 dawned, the killer showed no signs of stopping. A woman walking along Lake Erie stumbled across the torso of a woman floating near the shore. Within weeks, another body appeared, butchered in the same manner. The city's sense of doom deepened. It seemed that no matter how many patrols Ness deployed, no matter how many suspects were questioned, the killer's blade found new prey. One of the most haunting discoveries occurred in September 1937, when a young laborer found the upper half of a woman's torso in the Cuyahoga River. Weeks later, her lower half washed ashore. Like so many before her, she was never identified. Police officers who worked the case later admitted the horror took a personal toll. One detective confided that he often dreamed of headless bodies, waking drenched in sweat. Others turned to alcohol to numb the images burned into their minds. By this time, the number of confirmed victims had climbed into double digits. Some said 12, others 14, still others 16. The lack of consistent records added to the confusion, but what was clear was that Cleveland had a serial killer unlike any it had ever seen before or since. Ness, for all his prestige, was beginning to falter under the pressure. Critics accused him of being more concerned with his public image than with solving the murders. The torso killer had made the police look powerless, and in turn, the city's star crime fighter looked ordinary, even ineffective. Still, Ness refused to give up. He doubled down on interrogations, focusing on anyone with medical training, anyone with access to butcher knives, anyone seen near the riverbanks at night. Yet for every suspect questioned, another dead end awaited. Then came the chilling possibility that the killer might be taunting the authorities directly. Some crime scene details seemed staged, almost theatrical: the careful arrangement of limbs, the placement of remains where they would be easily found. Was he daring the police to catch him? Was he enjoying the spectacle? If so, it worked. Each discovery drew crowds of gawkers, journalists scribbling notes as the coroner's men carted away boxes and bags of human remains. Fear reshaped the city. Children were warned never to wander far, single women avoided walking home after dark, and the homeless, those who hadn't already fled the ruins of Kingsbury Run, moved constantly, fearful of being the next target. The city that once prided itself on industry and growth now carried the stench of death in its streets. The investigation reached a fever pitch when whispers began to circulate about a suspect with real promise, a man with medical training, a violent temper, and a family history of mental illness. His name would soon become central to the case, though not in the way many expected. For Eliot Ness and his men, the hunt was narrowing. But the closer they thought they were to unmasking the killer, the more elusive he seemed to become. The late 1930s brought no reprieve from the terror that had gripped Cleveland. By now, the torso killer had carved a trail of blood through the city, leaving a collection of mutilated victims scattered in riverbeds, train yards, and even in plain sight near the city streets. The brutality and frequency of the killings forced both police and citizens to accept a grim reality. This was not the work of a man who would stop on his own. He had developed a rhythm, a methodical approach to murder, and he seemed to thrive on the fear he created. Yet for all the horror, the authorities had no name, no face, no definitive suspect. What they did have was a growing file of circumstantial evidence, a city losing patience, and a lawman in Eliot Ness who was determined at any cost to leave his mark on the case. In 1938, 2 more dismembered bodies appeared, bringing the tally of known victims to at least 12. Some counted as many as 16, even 20, depending on how one defined the killer's signature. These murders occurred even after Ness's controversial raids, proving the destruction of the shantytowns had done little to curb the violence. To the public, Ness's strategy looked like failure. The newspapers, once his ally, began to criticize him openly. They reminded Clevelanders of his glory days in Chicago, contrasting that success with his inability to capture a single murderer in his own city. The pressure was suffocating. It was around this time that police investigators began to focus their suspicions on one man in particular, Dr. Francis E. Sweeney. A World War I veteran, Sweeney had served as a surgeon in the Army, where he witnessed and performed amputations under brutal battlefield conditions. Those experiences left scars, both physical and psychological. By the 1930s, he was struggling with alcoholism, marital problems, and an increasingly erratic personality. He was also, importantly, known to wander through Kingsbury Run, sometimes muttering to himself, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. Sweeney matched many aspects of the killer's profile. He had medical training. He knew how to dismember a body with precision. He was violent when drunk, and his wife accused him of abusive behavior. To investigators, he seemed almost too perfect a suspect. Ness himself became convinced that Sweeney was the man they were looking for. But proving it was another matter. Evidence was thin, mostly circumstantial. No murder weapons were recovered. No eyewitnesses placed him at crime scenes. Forensics could not tie him to the victims. What Ness did have was his authority, and he used it aggressively. In 1938, he ordered Sweeney into what amounted to an unofficial interrogation, a marathon grilling session that allegedly lasted more than a week. Reports later suggested that Ness's men subjected Sweeney to physical and psychological stress, hoping to break him into a confession. If true, it bordered on coercion. Sweeney, however, never confessed. He denied involvement, and eventually his mental health deteriorated so badly that he committed himself to a veterans' hospital. There, he would spend most of the rest of his life, plagued by alcoholism and paranoia. Ness believed he had his man, but without hard evidence he couldn't make an arrest. To the public, the case remained unsolved. Still, there were hints, strange ones, that Ness might have been right. For years after his confinement, Sweeney sent threatening postcards and letters to Ness, mocking him, taunting him for failing to make an arrest. The communications were unnerving. One postcard was signed King of Kingsbury Run, a direct reference to the murder sites. Were these the ramblings of a guilty man gloating from his hospital bed, or simply the ravings of a disturbed veteran who knew his notoriety gave him power over Cleveland's most famous lawman? Historians still debate the question, but the possibility that the killer taunted Ness from afar adds another sinister dimension to the case. While Sweeney remained the prime suspect in Ness's eyes, another man would briefly take the spotlight. In 1939, police arrested Frank Dolezal, a bricklayer who had once lived with one of the victims, Florence Polillo. Desperate to show progress, authorities pinned hopes on Dolezal as their killer. He was interrogated harshly, and after hours of questioning, he signed a confession. But the details didn't line up. His story changed with each retelling, and forensic evidence did not support his guilt. Before the case could be tested in court, Dolezal was found dead in his jail cell, hanging from a bedsheet. Officials ruled it a suicide, but whispers of police misconduct followed. To many, it appeared as though the city had tried to close the case by scapegoating a vulnerable man. With Dolezal's death, the investigation lost credibility. Public faith in the police evaporated, and Eliot Ness's once shining reputation dimmed permanently. Though he continued to serve as safety director, his career never fully recovered. In later years, he drifted from job to job, even running unsuccessfully for mayor. When he died in 1957, penniless and largely forgotten, the shadow of the Torso murders still loomed over his legacy. The killings themselves slowed after 1938, leading some to believe that Ness's pressure on Sweeney, or perhaps his confinement, had ended the spree. Others argued the killer simply moved on, changing his hunting grounds. Indeed, similar unsolved murders cropped up in nearby states, with decapitated and dismembered bodies discovered in ways that bore striking resemblance to the Cleveland cases. Was the Torso killer a drifter, leaving once Cleveland became too dangerous for him? Or was the terror confined to one twisted soul who, through illness or institutionalization, was finally rendered harmless? The questions were never answered. For the city of Cleveland, the Torso murders became more than a series of crimes. They were a wound that festered in the public consciousness. The brutality of the killings challenged people's sense of safety, exposing vulnerabilities in a city already weakened by economic despair. The case also highlighted the limitations of 1930s law enforcement. Without modern forensics, investigators relied on hunches, coerced confessions, and circumstantial evidence. The Torso killer exploited those gaps masterfully, disappearing into history without ever facing a trial. The victims, meanwhile, became almost anonymous in death. Because so many were poor, homeless, or transient, their identities were often reduced to nicknames in newspaper columns. The tattooed man, the Lady of the Lake, the unidentified John Does. This anonymity only deepened the horror. The killer wasn't just murdering individuals, he was erasing them, stripping them of names, faces, and dignity. In many ways, that erasure was his most terrifying weapon. Over time, the case has been studied by criminologists, historians, and even modern forensic experts. Some argue that Sweeney was almost certainly guilty, pointing to his medical knowledge, his violent tendencies, and his taunting correspondence with Ness. Others caution that the evidence is too thin, that Ness may have fixated on Sweeney to protect his own reputation, and that the true killer may have been someone else entirely. Theories abound. A rogue butcher, a deranged drifter, even multiple killers operating independently in a city where crime and poverty made people vanish easily. Cleveland itself has not forgotten. The Kingsbury Run of the 1930s has long since been transformed, the shantytowns and train yards replaced by modern infrastructure. Yet the stories linger. Local museums, historical societies, and true crime authors keep the memory of the Torso murders alive. Documentaries and books revisit the case, each offering new angles but rarely new answers. The fascination endures because the mystery endures, an unsolved puzzle that seems to defy closure. What made the case particularly haunting was not just the violence, but the way it mirrored the despair of the times. The Great Depression was an era when thousands lost homes, jobs, and identities. The torso killer's victims, faceless, nameless, abandoned, embodied that loss in the most horrific way possible. They were not only victims of a murderer, but also victims of an era that allowed them to slip into invisibility until a killer took their lives. Today, nearly a century later, the Cleveland torso murders remain one of America's most chilling unsolved serial cases. They sit alongside Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac Killer, and the Black Dahlia in the pantheon of grim mysteries that continue to captivate. Each generation revisits them, hoping for a breakthrough, a new clue, or a fresh theory that will finally unmask the butcher who stalked the streets of 1930s Cleveland. But as time passes, the chances of solving the case grow ever slimmer. The truth may lie buried with the victims, their bones resting in unmarked graves, or it may have died with Francis Sweeney in his hospital bed, or with Frank Dolezal in his lonely cell. What is certain is that the torso killer succeeded in what many murderers fail to achieve: immortality. He remains nameless, faceless, a shadow on the edge of history, his crimes retold not just as murders, but as legends of terror. In the end, perhaps that was his final act of cruelty. By never being caught, never being unmasked, the killer denied closure not just to his victims, but to an entire city. Cleveland was left to carry the weight of the unknown, the fear of the unseen. And in that silence, the torso killer continues to live, haunting the imagination, a reminder that some mysteries are destined never to be solved.